Hey folks, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to investigate the auto-scaling API, CLI, and a little bit of the SDK as well. Now, if you're preparing for the DevOps Professional certification exam, you've probably looked at AWS's professional exam blueprint. And multiple times in the blueprint, in Domain 1 and Domain 2, the blueprint singles out tasks using the AWS SDKs, CLI, and APIs. So it's good to just get familiar with these resources, knowing where they are and how to use them. And we'll finish up the lesson with a little bit of work from the command line interface. Now, it's important to realize that when using the CLI or different SDKs, the method names might be different than the API call names. And we'll see that in this lesson. We'll also find the API auto-scaling guide, and we're going to use that at the end of the lesson. Look at common API calls, compare common API calls to the CLI or RESTful name. Now, so far in this section with auto-scaling, we've done a lot of work from the AWS Management Console, but we'll see that using the CLI can be fast, and with scripts, we can begin to automate as well. So there are advantages to using the CLI. All right, so if we browse to aws.amazon.com/documentation/auto-scaling, we can start to look at some of this documentation. We have our API reference, and you'll note some of the calls. And right away, you might notice that these API calls don't have dashes as the CLI commands do. So that's a major difference. And we can also see the auto-scaling section of the AWS CLI reference. And we'll get into a bit more of this shortly. And notice to our left, SDKs and tools. This really opens things up. Developer tools, AWS Code Commit, Code Pipeline, Code Build, Code Deploy. Here's all our SDKs: Java, .NET, Node.js, Python. Some of our favorite IDEs: Eclipse, Visual Studio, command line tools, PowerShell, and of course the CLI. All right, now let's look at our CLI commands for auto-scaling. And there would be our favorite, probably, create auto-scaling group. Now we can see all the options we have here. Auto-scaling group name, launch configuration name, launch template, min size, max size. And then we'll get a description of all of our options, some syntax, and down at the bottom is where we'll get an example. Create an auto-scaling group in a VPC, auto-scaling group behind an Elastic Load Balancer. I know there's one in, placement group. Launch instances into a placement group. So the CLI can be very powerful and, again, very quick and very conducive to scripting and automating things. Now, notice up top, we have some namespacing here. And we'll see when we go to the CLI, and we're going to create an auto-scaling group. We're going to preface this command with AWS space auto-scaling, and then a command, and of course the necessary options. Okay, so looks fairly simple to create an auto-scaling group from the CLI, but usually we're going to want to create a launch configuration. Not always. We can certainly specify an existing launch configuration. But let's check this one out. And again, same namespacing. And here are all of our options and details on those options. And I usually rush down and just get my example and learn by doing. Here are some examples. This is interesting. This one creates one using spot instances. Note specifying the spot price. This one's referencing a bootstrapping script with a user data option. So again, I always jump to the examples, and it's usually pretty easy to figure out what you need to do. Okay. And note, really helpful here is the API documentation So let's jump over to there real quick. And again, first thing we'll notice the difference between CLI and the API. The API does not have the dashes, but this will just run you through how you can make an API call to create a launch configuration and information on all of your available parameters, instance type, launch configuration name, there's your spot price, and any errors you might receive back. Already exists, limit exceeded, and here's an example of an API call to create a launch configuration. Really cool stuff, and it just takes a little bit of poking around and trying these things out, and it's really easy to ramp up on. Now, what about SDKs? What if you want to do some scripting with maybe Python or PHP? And we see all of our SDKs. Some of these I'm very familiar with and some not so much. Let's check out Python. Let's check out the Python documentation. Do a search on auto scaling, and there we go. So, same call, Python SDK, create underscore auto underscore scaling underscore group. API uses no spaces. CLI uses dashes. Python SDK is using underscore. So it's just syntax, and we just have to be familiar with the differences. So with any of these options, we can script our commands and we can start to automate some of these things. And that's really where the power of CLI, the SDKs, or the API come into play. It's good to familiarize yourself with the documentation on the CLI, APIs, and the SDKs. And really, once you get your feet wet, it's not difficult, and it's good to just practice some of these things. So in light of that, let's go do that. Let's practice a few of our auto-scaling commands. I'm logged into the management console, and let's go to our auto-scaling groups. And I'm going to switch the split screen. I'm going to bring up a terminal window. All right, so I've already SSH'd into an EC2 instance in my account. Now let's say we get here and we just draw a blank, or we just don't know how to use the commands or what commands. We can just do AWS auto scaling help. And we'll see it's paginated here. Some of the available commands: attach instances, attach load balancer, create launch configuration, create auto scaling group, describe auto scaling groups. Quit out of that. Now let's take it a step further. Let's say we know the command, we just don't really know the options. So let's check out the create launch configuration command. And again, we can use help, and just like the documentation, it's going to show us our options and then a bit more detail on our options. This looks straight from the documentation. I anticipate we'll get an example down here shortly. There we go. Okay, so there are a lot of ways to get help. We can get help straight from the CLI, and if we have time, we can go out to the documentation. All right, well, let's see what's going on in our environment. So if we wanted to create an auto-scaling group, we could easily see what launch configurations are available to us with the describe launch configurations command. In the console, in the management console, let's bounce over to launch configurations, and we have 4. And we have one with a great deal of user data. And we can see our CLI command showed 4 launch configurations. All right, what about auto-scaling groups? And we can use describe auto-scaling groups. There's our group name, and just verify, let's go over. This is showing, the describe is showing one auto-scaling group. Desired capacity, max size, launch configuration name, health check type. Let's clean up our screen a bit. And let's actually create a launch configuration. All right. So our command, we're going to provide our context here, AWS auto scaling, create launch configuration. We need to provide a launch configuration name. Let's call it lesson 6, second as in second launch configuration. We need to provide an image ID, and I'm glad I looked because that is incorrect. It's not an L, that is a 1. And then an instance type of T2 micro. So before we run that, let's bounce over to launch configurations. All right, let's run this command. And there we go. There is our new launch configuration. As you can see, when you get the hang of the CLI, this can be really quick. Not to mention scripting and automation capabilities. All right, so let's finish this lesson creating an auto-scaling group from the CLI. So let's bounce back over to auto-scaling groups. Okay, we provide our context, AWS auto-scaling, and our command create auto-scaling group. We need to provide the auto-scaling group name, lesson 6, ASG new. Launch configuration, we could select any of our 5 launch configurations. I selected ASG May 3rd, min size 0, max size 0. We're not spinning up any instances right now. And we need to pretty much say where we want this to go. The VPC zone identifier, subnet 859D40CD. So let's run this command. That was quick. Get concerned when they run that quick, but there it is. There's our new auto-scaling group from the CLI. So in this lesson, we learned a bit about the CLI, APIs, SDKs, some of the difference, most of it's syntax, and we created a launch configuration and an auto-scaling group from the CLI. So we've successfully completed our tasks in this lesson. Go ahead and mark this complete. Let's move on to the next.